The Land Rover Discovery 2 was produced between 1998 and 2004, and ours you see right here, it's a 2004 model. We've owned it for a few months now, and we've learned and discovered all the crazy features that we think makes it the most unique SUV ever made. Discovery 2, like the name suggests, is the second generation of Land Rover Discovery. The early Discovery 2s looked almost identical to the Discovery 1s. Here's what they really look like side by side, and you can almost tell no difference. But Land Rover claims that there were over 700 changes between the Disco 2 and the Disco 1 when they came out in 1998. When Land Rover introduced the Discovery, it was a pretty basic 4x4 SUV. It had a cloth interior. Most of them had small diesel engines for European markets, but by 2004 it had grown into this large four-door luxurious leather-clad V8 powered monster that you see here. It has four-wheel drive still. It's still very rugged underneath, but it got a reputation for being expensive, comfortable, and, well, just a little bit unreliable. A lot unreliable. The exterior design of the old Land Rover Discoveries is just amazing in my opinion. It's bolt upright, it's rugged, it's aggressive, but it's also really civilized and surprisingly refined and also very elegant. Part of what makes these so unique is right here, the Alpine windows. They let a lot of light in, and just the visibility situation in the Land Rover Discovery in general is awesome. We've got these huge squared off windows, very little in terms of blind spots. We've got these big rear quarter windows as well. It's just such a good looking truck. By the early 2000s, Land Rover was under the control of parent company Ford. And with a completely redesigned Land Rover Discovery coming in 2005, Land Rover essentially had to extend the shelf life of the then aging Discovery 2. And what they did is in 2003, they completely facelifted them and they gave them these really cool looking headlights that made it look a lot more like the completely redesigned Range Rover of the era. So we've got the main beam right here with our high beam in the circular pod down below, and then we have a turn signal and running lights on the side here. It's just a completely timeless design in my opinion. You know guys, even without the lift and the rock rails and the bumpers that our 04 Land Rover has here, Discoveries of this era, they just look really cool. Even today they're still relevant, and yeah, from a uniqueness standpoint, the design is definitely a winner. The one area where maybe this truck looks like the design essentially dates back to the early 90s is in the doors here, and that's because look how thin these window surrounds are. This is 2004, and that's got to be what, maybe a centimeter thick, half an inch? It's just so thin and delicate. And even the doors themselves, well, they're also really thin. However, they give a really satisfying thunk when you close them. This is about as close to a G-Wagon as you can get for about $4,500. Now once you open these G-Wagon like doors, the first thing that strikes you is just how modern and luxurious the interior is on this Discovery. Everything is covered in leather and soft touch materials and even some suede in places. Of course, we don't have the infotainment system or big screens of modern cars, but it still feels really luxurious even 14 years later. Now, the first thing that really strikes you is the steering wheel. If you had a black interior, you would have a black airbag and a black steering wheel surround. Pretty standard. But if you got a tan interior like this one, you still have a black airbag, but now you have a tan steering wheel surround. So it makes it look like this weird aftermarket two-tone leather wrapped steering wheel that shouldn't be here, but it's factory and it, gets pretty dirty because it's tan. And the other thing you notice about the steering wheel is just how thick it is. It almost feels like a baseball bat. It's got this really thick leather surround, and it's great to hold on to, especially on long road trips. We also have these volume controls and cruise control settings that are just slapped on the side. They almost look like an afterthought. The inside of the doors are a little bit funky as well. First off, we have this really, really comfortable suede door panel. Land Rover understood how people drive, especially in the United States, with one arm on the door, one arm on the steering wheel. This makes it so that your arm is nice and padded and cushy. I just love that. The other weird thing is this grab handle. It's not a plastic, it's more of like a rubber. It's got kind of this grippy texture. It feels like you're going out for an adventure every time you close the door. We also have this huge big pocket down here where you can put all sorts of stuff, and this little tiny pocket up above the speaker. When you're inside, these door handles feel really low mounted on the door, and they even have this, funny little wood trim tacked on that just probably doesn't need to be there. Next up is the seating position. Now you can't just simply get into a Land Rover. Instead, you rise into a Discovery and then perch yourself on top of the seats. And that's because Land Rover uses, at least they used, a seating position unlike any other. Now, Discovery 1, 2, 3, and 4 all had a very similar feeling when you drive down the road. You don't sit in a Land Rover, you sit on top of it. And that gives you a command view of everything. The people in front of you, the view of the outside world. It is just such an amazing, undescribable experience. Now, unfortunately, the newest Discovery, the Series 5, it's not like that anymore. They made it more like a car that you just simply get in and go. That's what I love about these older Land Rovers. It's an experience every time you get into one. Next up are the seat controls. They are not on the left side of the seat like you'd expect. We do, of course, have power seats. This was a luxury SUV, but they're right here on the center console. Now, it's pretty standard in that you have forward and backward, and then up and down and recline adjustments. But on the driver's side, you can also move the reclining adjustment up and down to increase or decrease lumbar support, but not on the passenger side. So passenger side doesn't have that lumbar support adjustment. The other weird thing is our window controls are also in the center. They are unlabeled. So we have 4 power windows, front and rear, but you know, you kind of have to guess on what does what. So that's the front, and then that's the back. And when you put them up, look at how sharp that is. The angle of the front windows where it nests into this A-pillar and the roof is so sharp. We also have our heated seats in the middle here. And the great thing is it's a one-position heated seat, but what makes them great is when you turn them on, they stay on because it's a mechanical actuation. It's not just a button that you have to push on every time you get into the truck. The next unique feature of the Land Rover Discovery is the shift mechanism here. 4-speed automatic transmission, and on the face of it, nothing too weird with either the shift lever or the bezel, but there is something weird. You see here on the driver's side, we have indicators for park, reverse, neutral, drive, 3, 2, 1, and the little light that indicates what gear you're in at night. But you'll also notice on the passenger side, we have the same exact indication: park, reverse, neutral, drive, 3, 2, 1. Now, I have a theory on why they did this. You see, this vehicle was produced in both left-hand drive and right-hand drive configurations. And by putting the instrumentation on both sides like this, it prevents Land Rover from having to manufacture a unique bezel for right-hand drive and left-hand drive nations. Now, the one annoying thing is to shift it out of park, of course, you have to pull a little shift lock release. And there you go, into drive. Except I'm not in drive, I'm in 2. That's drive. And that's because there's no detent or stopper to stop you from going into 3rd out of park. And every single person who has driven this vehicle for the first time or the second time, even the 3rd time, 9 times out of 10, they'll put it into 3rd instead of drive because there's nothing to stop the shifter from sliding into 3rd. Luckily, they do tell you up here in the instrumentation what gear you're going into, but it is something that does take some getting used to. The next cool thing we have with the transmission is a mode selection. So if I push the mode selection button when I'm in normal driving around high range, what it does is it engages a sport mode in the transmission programming. So it'll hold gears longer and shift more aggressively. The other cool feature with the mode selection button happens when you put the Land Rover into low range, because then it engages a manual setting in the transmission, and it really does act like a manual transmission. You see, in most vehicles, if I select, for example, 3rd gear on the automatic transmission shifter, the car will shift from 1st to 2nd to 3rd gear. Same thing if I select 2nd. It's not really locking it into 2nd because typically the car or truck will go 1st gear and 2nd gear. But if I have this Land Rover in low range with the manual mode on and I put it in 3rd gear, it's not going to go through 1st and 2nd to get to 3rd. It's going to always be in 3rd. Same thing with 2nd, same thing with 1st, same thing with drive, which is really 4th gear. So it really does lock you in the gear you select. It doesn't sequentially progress through gears to get to a maximum. Now, if you're not into Land Rovers, and I don't expect you to be, one thing you may not know is that Land Rovers throughout history have historically been permanent 4-wheel drive vehicles, so there's no way to select a 2-wheel drive mode. So transfer case is permanently in 4-wheel drive. Now, how do they do this and still maintain proper road characteristics? Well, essentially, they have a transfer case with an unlocked center diff. And this is great because it means all 4 wheels have the potential to get at least some of the engine's torque. However, if you're on ice, for example, and one wheel starts spinning, be it front or back, the power and torque is of course going to go the path of least resistance, and that wheel is just going to spin and spin, and you're going to be stuck. Now, there's an easy way around this. That, of course, is a center differential lock. Now, by locking the center differential, essentially what you're doing is saying, no, I actually want the torque split to be 50-50 front and rear, and then you can go along your merry way. And of course, when the pavement dries out, go ahead and unlock that center diff so you don't get crabbing around the corners. It's great. And all Discovery ones had that center diff lock because, you know, it did what you needed to do. When you were off-road, you turn it on. When you were on-road, you turn it off. Awesome. Now, in 1998, when Land Rover came out with the Discovery 2, they incorporated a pretty advanced traction control system that used brake distribution to send power where it needed to go when it needed to go there. And that was great, and they determined that that system was adequate without a center diff lock. So they stopped giving you the option to turn it on. And I say that very carefully because a lot of Land Rover Discovery 2s actually have the center diff lock incorporated in their transfer case. But there's no actuator to turn it on because Land Rover deemed it unnecessary in such an advanced vehicle with a modern traction control system. So there were Discovery 2s out on the road today that have a center diff lock that's ready to go, but there's no way to turn it on. There's no way to flick it on. Now, what this meant is a lot of owners went out and either jerry-rigged or retrofitted a system so they could actuate it manually, be it with a weird, funny screwdriver thing or a series of linkages. Now, in 2004, Land Rover, I'm going to say, came to their senses because people asked for it, and they brought the actuator back for the center differential lock. So in 2004 models, you can have a center diff lock engaged with traction control on. It's the best of both worlds. But why it took them, what, 5-6 years to do that? Yeah, that's a little bit frustrating. This Discovery, like pretty much every other modern advanced SUV off-roader, has a hill descent control, which is crazy to think about considering this vehicle came out in the late 90s. But even back then, yes, it had a hill descent control and it really does work. In fact, the entire traction control system in these Discovery 2s made them immensely good off-road. They really do send power where they need to go, and they're a good substitute for a lack of locking differentials. Now, the history of hill descent control is actually really interesting. You see, Land Rover pioneered hill descent control in the compact Freelander crossover SUV, and we talked to Bob Burns, who is, well, a Land Rover legend, who told us the story behind why it came to fruition. You see, back when they were developing the Freelander, they would off-road it with corporate Defenders, and when the Defenders would go downhill, they had a low-range transfer case, and they would go nice and slow and creep. Well, the Freelander had only a high range set of gears. There was no low range in the Freelander, and what would happen is when they were following the Defenders downhill off-road, they would go too fast and potentially run into the back of the Defenders. So how they came to solve this was the legendary hill descent control. You engage and it keeps the vehicle at a constant slow speed, allows you to really focus on your off-road driving. This truck has it, Freelanders have it, pretty much every Land Rover since this has had it. But there you go, a brief history of hill descent control. A Land Rover, of course, can't only be comfortable, it has to be off-road worthy. And the Discovery 2, even in stock form, is very off-road worthy. First off, very robust construction, body on a ladder frame, and we have solid axles front and rear, just like you'd find in a G-Wagon or a Wrangler. Now, the lowest hanging fruit in these old trucks is, of course, the differential, the pumpkin. And in the Discovery, they're actually in a line. So both front and rear pumpkins are in line with each other, which means if you avoid an obstacle with the front differential, you're probably going to avoid it in the rear. And it's also offset to one side, meaning you have the most clearance possible on one side of the vehicle, which is very nice thinking. Another interesting feature has to be the handbrake. Now, instead of operating the rear brakes, handbrakes on Discoveries actually operate a separate drum brake mounted right behind the transfer case. Really interesting engineering. Next up in our unique features is the climate control in this truck, which is dual zone, and that's awesome. It's automatic climate control. You just set the temperature, off you go. It does do this weird beep for every time you push any button. It has to beep at you. That's a little bit annoying. But what's a little bit odd is to view the external temperature in this truck, there's a button within the HVAC controls labeled EXT, and you push it and it tells you your external temperature. But what's frustrating is you can either have the internal temperature of the truck or the external, but not both at the same time. If you want to see what your external temperature is, you can't see what your temperature setting is set to. The cup holders are a little bit weird as well. They twist out and you can dump out their contents, and you can even dump out apparently the insert within the insert so that you can get them extra squeaky clean. And they're a little bit rattly and they looked a little bit tacked on. Definitely you can see that a lot of the interior design comes from the Discovery 1. This insert actually makes it so that you can have a smaller beverage in your cup holder. Now Land Rover, this was nice actually, because Land Rover knows that here in the United States we like to drink beverages when we go down the road, and we also like to drink large beverages. So you have a regular size cup and you also have a massive size cup in terms of options for your cup holders. That's really cool. The other weird interior design feature is the wood, or maybe it's fake wood. I'm not quite sure. It's very shiny, very early 2000s looking, but it's only placed in very specific places and it's not consistent. There's some wood here, there's a little bit of wood around the door handles, there's some weird wood trim up by the sunroof controls, but it's not in the doors, it's not really anywhere near the driver's side of the cockpit, it's just haphazardly placed around the interior. Now next up in the unique features has to be the sunroofs. And that's not particularly unusual. A lot of vehicles have front and rear sunroofs or a full panoramic sunroof. What is unusual is the sunroof, or should I say sun porthole, because it's pretty small, opens not only in the front but in the back. Yes, both sunroofs completely open. They open upwards and they open laterally as well, and I love that. There's also a sunroof lockout, so if you have kids in the back that are constantly playing with the sunroof, you can lock them out from that control up front here. But that is such a cool Land Rover feature that not a lot of other vehicles have. Now the other weird thing is there's no fixed shade. There's actually two shades. So say you're a passenger and you want sun, but the driver wants to be blocked out. Well, you can open up the passenger side, but not the driver's side of the sunshade. And it's not really a shade, it's actually more of a mesh. There's no way to block out the sun completely. It just still kind of seeps through whether you want it to or not. We also have a chart on the sun visor that tells us the highest points of the Land Rover Discovery so we don't damage it when pulling into garages. And if you think the front seat passengers get all the fun and interesting features, well, you would be completely wrong, because the back seat in the Discovery is just as exciting. First off, I want to talk about the fundamental design of the rear seats. Look at this roof. It kind of bubbles up toward the back, and that's because this truck uses stadium seating. Remember how I discussed how the front seats are more of like a perch where you sit on top of the truck? Well, the rear seats are even more so, because they actually sit higher than the front seats. Now, when you're sitting in the back of the Discovery, you can just see everything, and that's what this bubble's for. It's for additional headroom for the higher seats. In fact, I measured it, and the rear seat cushion is about 2 inches higher than the front seat cushion. Now, the Discovery has a pretty short wheelbase for the size of the rig, and that's great for off-roading because it's got, you know, a really good breakover angle. But it also means that the rear fender well really intrudes into the rear seat area. So getting in is, well, it's quite a small opening. It's actually a really small opening, and rear legroom isn't so good. But with the stadium seating, you really don't care because you feel like you're on top of the world, and with the extra headroom provided by this lift in the roofline, it is just awesome. The rear seats in some ways are even more fun off-road than the front seats. You even have these cool handles in the back of the front seats to grip onto. Now, Discovery 2s could be had in both 5 and 7 seat configurations, and this one has the climate controls for the second and third row seating, and there's vents in the roof. There's actually 3 vents in the second row, so even the middle seat doesn't have to suffer. And there's a snowflake button, which is to activate the AC system. And you must be thinking, well, I'm sure the AC system is just leftover air from the front, and you'd be wrong, because in the very back of the Discovery, there is an entirely separate air conditioning setup for just the second and third row passengers, which means that you can get icy cold air if you're in the back seats of a Discovery. And I just love that attention to detail, and it really does work. Now, the middle seat in the second row of the Discovery is pretty small and it's somewhat comfortable. But you know, what's cool about it is how it works, because when it is up, it works as a typical middle seat. It has a headrest. But when you put the center armrest down, say you only have 2 passengers in the back seats, the headrest and the actual entire middle seat fall down into the bench, which means you have a lot of visibility out the back, and that's really thoughtful. It not only provides additional comfort for the back 2 passengers, but it also provides additional visibility for the driver. At the back of the Discovery is one of the signature Land Rover Disco design cues. That, of course, is this oddly shaped rear window that kind of conforms to the rear mounted spare tire to provide as much rearward visibility as possible. I love that they did this in Discovery 1, Discovery 2, LR3 here in the United States, LR4 here, and then Discovery 5 no longer does this, but the design cue still imitates it in one way or another. Now this actually doesn't open upwards, it swings out to the side. It's a little bit heavy, and there's a little escape handle here too that gets the rear latch open. Now in the back we have this truck outfitted as an adventure rig, which is why it's so dirty, and we have some recovery stuff and a cooler and some straps and oil, which you need because it's a Land Rover, and you know, the list goes on and on. Now over here on the rear left side of the vehicle is where the air conditioning unit lives for the rear seats, and we can also see our additional vents for the third row, which would fold out from the side if we had it installed. The central locking in this Land Rover is also super unusual. So on the key there's one button to unlock it and one button to lock it. Now when it's locked, of course I can't get into the vehicle, but Land Rover also has a feature they call Super Lock. I'm not kidding, it is a real feature. If you double click the lock button on a Land Rover, the indicators flash 3 times, and not only is it locked from the outside, but if I were to break this window and grab the door handle from the inside, the door wouldn't open either. The heart of this Land Rover has a really unusual history. Now if I open it up, it's a 4.6 liter V8. It makes, oh come on, I don't know, 217 horsepower, 300 pound-feet of torque. Nothing that crazy. This is a legendary engine. This is the last of a line known as the Rover V8. Now the Rover V8 actually dates back to the early 1960s, and it comes from America. This was originally a Buick engine. It's all aluminum heads and aluminum blocks, and if you were alive in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, and remember British cars from that period, if they had a V8 engine, it was almost certainly a Rover V8. They used it in MGs, they used it in Morgans, they used it in TVRs, they used it in Range Rovers, and this was the final version used in this Land Rover Discovery. Of course, it was altered from its origins in the early 1960s. It has fuel injection, and it's been enlarged, ranging from a 3.5 to like a 3.9. There was a 4 liter, there was a 4.2, there were some weird versions, and then the last in the line, the 4.6. Now when this Land Rover was new, it actually had kind of an interesting jack placement. It was here under the hood. This is where the bottle jack lived, and well, the bottle jack is gone because this truck is lifted and we have a high lift jack. But one thing remains that is a really cool feature I wish more manufacturers incorporated in their vehicles. It's this funny little plastic device, and if you look closely, it has a Rover, a Land Rover, and an MG logo on here. So that's a cool piece of history. If I go ahead and, how does this work? Spin it out like that. This is now a wheel chock, and I can safely chock my wheels using this so that the vehicle doesn't slide around when I'm jacking, and it lives perfectly under the hood. The armrests in these old Discoveries and even in newer Land Rover and Range Rover products are very nice indeed, and that's because the armrests are completely adjustable on both the driver and passenger side. Say the center console just isn't comfy enough for you. Well, you have an armrest that you can adjust using a little dial to any height and any position. What a nice piece of luxurious English tech. The trip and odometer computer in a Land Rover Discovery 2 is a little bit funky, so if I go ahead and push the reset button, of course it resets the trip, but if you push and hold the reset button like you would in other vehicles to reset the trip, it actually converts the odometer from miles to kilometers or vice versa. So if you lend your Land Rover to someone and they fill it up with gas for you and clear the trip, and all of a sudden your vehicle has 1.6 times the number of miles it should, don't get frightened, they probably just converted the odometer from miles to kilometers. Next up on our list of the unique and awesome attributes on this old Discovery is just the sheer number of cubbies. Let's take a look. There are large cubbies in the bottom of the door, and then there's this little tiny speaker cubby, which is about the size of a really fat mouse. There are these really big map pockets above the visors, and although maps are somewhat a thing of the past, they're perfect for holding cell phones, even the larger iPhones like this one. There's a big center console with even more storage and additional cup holders in the lid. There's an even larger glove box, which, well, doesn't fit very well. There is this super sneaky cubby underneath the front passenger seat, although ours has a hole here. I don't think that's supposed to be here. There are huge seat pockets on both the back of the passenger and driver's seats. There's this really cool swivel out rear ashtray, which even has a little sprung protector flap here so your ashes don't go spilling into the bottom of your center console. There's also a huge cubby on the back of this swing door here, where typically you'd find something like your owner's manual. Now the lug nuts on this old Land Rover are just massive. They're huge, but they're actually these stylized caps fixed on top of a lug nut, and what that means is in order to get these lug nuts off, if it gets really hot or really cold, you need to bring different size sockets, or so I'm told. Well, there you guys have it, a long list of the unique features and crazy cool things on these old Land Rover Discovery 2s. Now I'm sure after watching these videos, a lot of you guys are thinking, well, that's by far not the most unique SUV in the world, this is, and I'd love to hear that in the comments below. I do read all your comments, even your mean comments, so, you know, like, take it easy on me, guys. But as always, thank you so much for watching.